Have you ever sat down to write, opened the document, and then spent the next 40 minutes changing the same sentence over and over again? Or maybe you've been working on your first chapter for months, not because you don't know what happens next, but because it just doesn't feel good enough yet. It never feels quite right. There's always one more thing to fix. You might call that dedication. You might even tell yourself that you have high standards. But what if it's not high standards at all? What if underneath all of that rewriting and refining and holding back is actually fear? Today we're talking about perfectionism, what it really is, how to recognize it when it's driving your writing, and how to move past it without abandoning the quality you care about. Because perfectionism and high standards aren't the same thing. And once you can tell the difference, writing gets a whole lot easier. If you feel called to write a book, but writer's block, procrastination, and self-doubt keep pulling you from the page, you're not alone, and you're not meant to stay stuck. Hi, I'm Madison Michaels, author and life coach, and I've created this podcast as a creative space grounded in faith and mindset transformations to help you break through your blocks, gain creative clarity, and finally finish the book you're meant to write. So grab your cup of liquid gold and let's write the darn book together. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Write the Darn Book. I'm your host, Madison Michaels, and today we're diving into something that I think affects almost every writer I've ever spoken to: perfectionism. Specifically, we're unpacking what's actually underneath it, because most of the time it's not what writers think it is. Perfectionism is one of those things that gets a lot of positive press. We wear it like a badge of honour. I'm a perfectionist sounds like a strength. It sounds like you care deeply, like you have high standards, like you're not someone who half-heartedly throws things together. And there's a version of caring deeply about your craft that is genuinely healthy and worth nurturing. And that version is called craft-driven excellence. It's the part of you that wants your writing to be the very best it can be, and it pushes you to go back and find the right word, and it makes you feel proud of what you've created. But that's not what most writers mean when they say they're perfectionists. Most of the time, what they're describing is something else entirely. Something that doesn't actually make the writing better, something that makes it harder to write at all. And that's fear-driven perfectionism. And the difference between the two matters enormously. Craft-driven excellence moves you forward. When excellence is the engine, you write the scene, you notice it could be stronger, and you go back and make it better. There's momentum. There's a sense of creative satisfaction when you get it right. You're improving the work, and the work is growing. Fear-driven perfectionism, on the other hand, stalls you. It tells you the work needs to be flawless before anyone can see it. It tells you that if it's not perfect, it means something about your worth or your talent or your right to call yourself a writer. It keeps you polishing the first chapter for 8 months while chapters 2 through to 30 just wait there unwritten. It whispers that starting something imperfect is the same as failing. And here's the thing that makes this sound so difficult to untangle. Fear-driven perfectionism wears the costume of caring. It looks responsible. It looks like quality control. But underneath, it's almost always about one thing: the fear of being judged. I want to tell you about a chapter of my own that I rewrote 14 times. Yes, 14. Not 14 drafts of the whole book, 14 rewrites of one chapter. I was working on a particular scene in my manuscript and something kept stopping me from moving forward. Every time I'd finish the chapter, I'd read it back to myself, feel a kind of low-level dread, and I'd start again. I told myself the pacing was off. Then I told myself, the dialogue feels a bit stilted. Then I decided that the point of view needed shifting. And each time I'd rewrite it, I'd read it back, and I'd feel almost satisfied, and then I'd find something new to fix. What I didn't admit to myself for a very long time was that chapter was actually fine. More than fine, in fact. And it was doing exactly what it needed to do for the story. But it was also the chapter where the reader was going to see something quite vulnerable in the protagonist, a crack in her armour, so to speak, and a moment of real emotional exposure. And somewhere in my subconscious, I'd connected that character's vulnerability with my own. If people read that chapter and don't feel it, if they found it perhaps overwrought or unconvincing or too much, that felt like a verdict on me, on my ability to write real human emotion, on whether I belonged in this space of writing at all. Those 14 rewrites weren't about the chapter. They were about managing my fear of being seen. The chapter was actually published very close to version 3, and all of that additional work, all of those weeks that I spent circling and rewriting it and starting again, it didn't actually significantly improve the chapter at all. It just delayed writing the book. And that was the moment that I started to understand the difference between working hard in service of the story and working hard in service of my own fear. The first thing I want you to have is a way to actually recognize when perfectionism is fear rather than craft, because they can feel identical from the inside. Both feel like care, both feel like standards, but there are some very specific signs that fear is running the show. The first sign is that you're circling rather than progressing. If you've been working on the same chapter, the same scene perhaps, or the same opening page for weeks or months without meaningful forward movement in the manuscript, that's a signal worth paying attention to. Excellence moves the work forward. Fear keeps you stuck in the same place. The second sign is that the stakes feel personal rather than craft-based. Ask yourself honestly, what am I afraid will happen if this isn't perfect? And if your answers are things like, people will think I'm a bad writer, or I'll be exposed as someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, or perhaps people will laugh at it, or I'll have to face the fact that I'm not talented enough, those are fear signals. They're about identity and judgment. They're not about whether the scene works. The third sign is that good enough never arrives. Craft-driven excellence has an endpoint. You reach a moment where you genuinely feel that the work is strong and you move on. Fear-driven perfectionism keeps shifting the goalpost. No version is ever quite right, and there's always something more to fix. And that pattern of the goalposts moving, that's fear, not craft. So here's a simple tool I want you to apply to your current work. It's called the Perfectionism Audit, and it has just 2 questions. The first question is this: is the time I'm spending on this actually improving it, or am I managing anxiety about it? And sit with that question honestly. When you go back to rework something, do you feel a genuine sense of the writing's getting stronger? Or do you feel a kind of temporary relief, the relief of perhaps not having to move forward or not having to show it to anyone just yet, or staying safely in the place where it could still become perfect? If it's the first, keep going. Your instincts are serving you. But if it's the second, that's worth naming. You're not refining, you're actually delaying. Now, the second question is, what is the actual cost of moving forward with this as it is? Not the emotional cost, the craft cost. What specifically would be weaker in the story if you moved on from this scene right now? If you can give a specific craft answer, then yes, keep working on it. If the answer is vague, or if it becomes about how it will look or how you'll be perceived, then you've found your fear. Now, I want to introduce you to a concept that's genuinely changed the way I write. I call it the good enough to move standard. And this isn't the same thing as lowering your standards. I want to be very clear about that, because I know some of you will feel a kind of resistance to the word enough. This isn't about producing mediocre work. It's about recognizing that a first draft, or even a second or a third draft, isn't supposed to be finished or polished. It's not the published version of your book. Good enough to move means this section is doing its job well enough that I can move forward and continue writing the story. Then I can come back to it later. I can refine it in revision. But right now, the most important thing is that the story keeps moving and I keep writing. Remember, your first draft isn't your last draft. Your book isn't going to be published in the state it's in right now. Every author who's ever put a book out into the world did so after multiple rounds of revision and editing. The draft you're writing now is meant to be imperfect. That's its purpose. Its job is to exist, not to be flawless. Now, I've just finished going through edits for my 9th book, and we still did edits. It's never perfect the first time because there's always things you can do to refine it and just make it that little bit tighter and better. So remember, your job is to get the words down, okay? You can revise after. When you hold your first draft to a published book standard, you're judging a building's foundation by asking, why doesn't it look like the finished architecture pictures, The foundation needs to exist first, and then you build the rest of the building around that foundation. And the last thing is usually the visual aesthetics afterwards. So remember that, build the foundation first, and then the rest of the building can follow, or as in your case, the rest of the book. So let's make this practical. When you notice that you've been in the same section for a long time and the audit tells you it's fear rather than craft, here's what I want you to do. First, name it, and not with judgment, just with clarity. You might literally say to yourself, I'm perfecting out of fear right now. This is a protection mechanism. My brain's trying to keep me safe from judgment by making it impossible to move forward. Naming it takes away some of its power. Second, write a note to yourself in the document, and you can use brackets or italics or just a comment, something like, revisit this scene in the second draft, or perhaps it could be, this dialogue might need work, and then leave it at that. You're not abandoning the problem, you're just parking it for the revision phase where it belongs. Third, commit to a good enough to move pass. Go through the section one more time with the specific question in mind. Does this scene do what it needs to do for the story? Not, is it perfect? And not, will people love it? Just, does it serve the story? And if it's a yes, move forward. The writers who finish their books aren't the ones who write the most perfectly. They're the ones who've learnt to keep moving and finish the book. Imperfect forward movement will always serve your book more than indefinite, perfect stillness. Now, I want to touch briefly on how perfectionism shows up differently depending on your writing personality, because this is something that comes up a lot in writing coaching. Now, if you're a dove, you're someone who values harmony and connection in your writing life. Perfectionism can often show up as a fear of disappointing readers or the people close to you, and you're less concerned with being judged as untalented, but more concerned with the work not being meaningful enough or not being worth someone's time. For ours, it tends to be the most analytical version of perfectionism. Every structural detail must be correct. Every plot point must actually hold and be logical. Every timeline must be watertight before moving on. The challenge is that this standard applied too early before the full story exists can make forward movement almost impossible. For peacocks, perfectionism often clusters around the voice. The writing needs to sparkle. Every sentence needs to sing and to shine. And then the energy dips when the prose is just functional rather than brilliant. And for eagles, perfectionism can masquerade as efficiency. The work needs to be done right the first time, and there's no patience for mess or iteration, which means the willingness to write a rough draft that gets refined later can feel fundamentally at odds with how you operate. None of these patterns are flaws. They all come from something you care about. But recognizing where your perfectionism lives means you can work with it more skillfully rather than being surprised by it at every turn. All right, my friends, so here's your invitation for this week. I want you to take your current manuscript and find one place where you've been spending more time than feels like genuine improvement. One scene, one chapter, one paragraph perhaps that you keep returning to without a clear craft reason for doing so. Run it through the perfectionism audit and ask both questions honestly. And if the audit tells you that it's fear rather than craft, give it a good enough to move past. Make the note, acknowledge what needs revisiting in draft 2, and then move forward and keep writing. Remember, your book needs you to keep moving more than it needs you to perfect what already exists. Now, if you've been listening and nodding along thinking, yes, that's exactly me, that recognition is worth acting on. Sometimes the shift from stuck to moving happens in a single conversation. I offer a free 15-minute clarity call for writers exploring whether coaching is the right next step for them. No pressure, no pitch. Just head to madisonmichaels.com/call and schedule in your free chat with me, because I'd love to talk to you and see whether I can help you to get from where you are to where you want to be. All right, my friends, thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Perfectionism is one of the most common and most quietly destructive patterns in a writer's life. And it's not because it means you don't care. It's precisely because you do care so much. And the writers I've worked with who have been able to loosen its grip always say the same thing. They wish they'd done it sooner. Remember, you are allowed to write imperfectly. You're allowed to move forward without everything being exactly right. The book you're working on deserves to exist in the world, not in the version where every word is polished to within an inch of its life before it's allowed to be written, but in the version where you actually write it, where you actually finish it, and where you actually get it to your readers. You, my friend, are the vessel for your story. No one can write your book except you. So get out of your own way, let the words flow through you and onto the page. Until next time, my friend, take care and let's write the done book together. My friend, I hope today's episode gave you exactly what you needed for your writing journey. And if it did, would you take 30 seconds to share it with another writer who's struggling to start or finish their book? And if you're loving the show, I'd be so grateful if you left a quick review. It means the world to me and truly makes my day to know that this podcast is helping you. And as you head back into your week, I hope you feel more supported and connected to your creativity. And remember, you're a vessel for the story. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, I'm off to refill my cup of liquid gold and go and do a little writing of my own. Take care, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode of Write the Darn Book.